So I have to admit that including 2 or 3 things I know about her in this group of films as a retrospective is a bit of a fudge, because it's not that it hasn't influenced me, it definitely has, but because what really is important here is Godard, and I think it's a little tough to reduce Godard down to a single film as a major influence. It's more the model that he provides. Now, as far as 2 or 3 things I know about her is concerned, it's very easy for me to describe how it's been influential because it's of its model of combining documentary and fiction. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the film, it follows a working class woman who has an apartment in the new suburbs of Paris and follows her through the day as she goes from one situation to another. And basically, her life is fairly aimless, but the point is that her husband doesn't make quite enough money for them to be able to live up to the standard that they've accepted. So she has to get money, and she does it through prostitution. And so the day that you watch is her moving from one trick to the next and the issues related to it, all of which could be treated as straight fiction. But what Godard does with it is using the fictional element as a means of opening up the topic and then embroidering it with a lot of digressive speculation and occasional pontification on the soundtrack. And it is that combination which I have always found extremely powerful, plus the interest in consumerism, or I should say the critique of consumerism as a subject, which, yes, has been influential on me as well. The reason I hesitate in singling out 2 or 3 things I know about her, even though I think it is Godard's best film, is that Godard himself is such an influential and problematic figure. Godard is generally considered to be one of the primary figures of the French New Wave and is always cited for his unconventional, idiosyncratic approach, and often is described in relation to effectively 3 periods in his career. A period that got him the attention initially from his first film Breathless in 1959 through 1968. 1968 is the pivotal year because that was the year when the Paris students rose up against the de Gaulle government. After 1968, his work becomes more and more didactic and drier and drier and drier until around 1980, he kind of put that behind him and went back to a more commercially viable approach. I bring all this up because my first exposure to Godard was from that problematic period between 1968 and 1980, and that was Vent d'Est, Wind from the East, which was touted as a Marxist Western. You can accept that or not, but it's a very, very, very difficult film to get through. However, I cite it not only because it was my first exposure to Godard, but because it does represent a particular approach to film that was very powerful and current for a while. The first generation of people who were exposed to and enthusiastic about Godard, that's to say the people who were more or less contemporaneous with his characters in the 60s films, those are the true acolytes, if you will, of Godard, which is to say that they were the ones who supported or didn't support what he was doing at the time. For people of my generation, paradoxically, we were exposed to Godard effectively as an academic figure, which is to say that the initial controversies had passed, and he instead was touted as an example of militant filmmaking, of alternative filmmaking, if you will. Now, as I said, I'm a little too young to have bought into that entirely. When I did buy into it, I was still in my early 20s and really didn't know exactly what the kind of thing he was advocating meant. Having said all of that, though, I would insist that Godard is an incredibly important influence, not just on me, but on all filmmakers. Any filmmaker who is interested in doing a little bit more than what's already established has to at least take a look at Godard. You don't have to like him, you can hate him, but you have to at least be exposed to his work, because what he represents, and which I think is certainly the most important aspect of his work for me at a purely model level, is his unconventional approach, his refusal to accept worn-out technique and old ideas just because they're there. And that, to me is an incredibly important thing. And up to his death, he remained abrasive and acerbic and a counter to everybody else, but you can't ignore him. And that's why I wanted to include a film of his that I definitely like, and which, yes, I can point to as a direct influence in some of my work. So anyway, on that note, 2 or 3 things I know about her. 2 or 3 things I know about Godard.